Told you the number crunchers at EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, have come up with the first estimate of just how many jobs this country would lose under Republican economic policy. But in our fourth story tonight, before we reveal that number, we're going to show you our math first because it's fun. House Republican leader Boehner says he has a two-pronged approach: freeze tax rates where President Bush left them, and freeze spending, except for national security, where President Bush left that. So what would this do to the economy? It ain't good. Here's how it works. Job creation is generally tied to gross domestic product, GDP, basically how much money the country makes. Renewing those Bush tax cuts for the rich would do some good for the GDP, but the problem is tax cuts for the rich are the worst way to boost the GDP and create jobs, giving less bang for the buck than any other method. The tax cuts, EPI says, would boost next year's GDP by just $12.2 billion. And the spending cuts? Boehner would reduce government spending levels to 2008 levels, meaning a 23% cut in spending on infrastructure, on roads, on bridges, on government workers, on teachers, on scientists, and so on. Obviously, paying salaries to workers creates more jobs than helping rich people stuff their savings accounts full of dough. So using Congressional Budget Office formulas, the EPI calculates that Boehner's spending cuts would cut the gross domestic product by $183.2 billion. Now prepare for math. $12.2 billion gained minus $183.2 billion equals $171 billion. $171 billion lost from America's gross domestic product. That is a 1.1% drop from next year's estimated GDP. And remember, I told you that GDP is tied to jobs? The rate is roughly 1 million jobs for every 1% GDP. So the 1.1% drop in GDP from the Republican economic plan would cost America 1.1 million jobs. But wait, you say, when the Bush tax cuts were passed in 2001 and 2003, job creation took off, didn't it? Well, Republicans say that uncertainty about tax rates holds back hiring. In December of 2000, it became certain that George W. Bush would become president and would get to pass some form of the tax cuts he had campaigned on. But the unemployment rate went from 3.9% the month he was appointed by the Supreme Court to 4.2% after his appointment removed all that uncertainty. In fairness, the tax cuts did not actually become law until June 2001, when unemployment had risen to 4.5%. So how many jobs did the tax cuts create when they were actually signed into law? Unemployment rose to 4.6% the next month, 4.9% the month after that, then 5%, 5.3%, 5.5%. But what about his second round of tax cuts signed into law in May of 2003, when unemployment had risen to 6.1%? It rose to 6.3% the next month. In all the years of his presidency, the unemployment rate dropped only below 4.5, what it was when Mr. Bush signed his first tax cuts into law, in just 4 months, dropping to 4.4 four times in 2006, in the middle of a housing boom. Let's turn now to Heather McGhee, Washington Director of DEMOS, a nonpartisan policy think tank. Once again, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Keith.
That analysis saying that a certain amount of spending cuts equals another certain amount of jobs lost. In this case, 1.1 million jobs lost if the Republicans got their way in this pledge. Does that sound right to you? And if it does, can you explain why those jobs would be lost?
Absolutely. That was a really important contribution that the Economic Policy Institute made today. And I think it really goes to show you the peril of what happens when politicians start legislating talking points instead of actual policies. Since the Reagan era, you've had the Republican mantra, the sort of bumper sticker being cut taxes, cut spending. And that's what the Boehner plan would do, cut taxes and cut spending. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of a jobless recovery from the deepest recession we've had since the Great Depression. Corporations are sitting and hoarding trillions of dollars in cash, and they're not hiring. The banks, which are sitting on trillions of dollars from the Federal Reserve, are not lending. States are in the red, so they're not, because of the housing crisis, so they're not able to increase demand. The federal government has to increase demand, and we know economic data shows from the CBO and all outside commentators that if you have government spending of the type that the Obama plan would do, infrastructure, research, education, and energy, you get $1.75 in economic output for every dollar that you spend. unfortunately, tax cuts, which are at the core of the Boehner plan, actually are more expensive than they are productive in the economy.
Republicans live on that mantra. Tax cuts equals job creation. Is it not only not true, but is the reverse actually true? Can tax cuts hurt job creation?
In this instance, they absolutely can, particularly because we're talking about the Bush tax cuts, which, as we know, the vast majority of went to the wealthiest 3% of Americans. Now, if I'm a working and middle-class person who's living paycheck to paycheck, I spend every dollar that I can hold on to. I spend it on groceries, I spend it on my kids' books, I spend it on gas for the car. I immediately throughput that, as we say, out into the economy. If I'm a millionaire or a billionaire, I, as you said, Keith, sock it away. And so the problem with using tax cuts as a stimulus is that it's far too expensive, and it ties the government's hands to do the more effective form of stimulus, such as infrastructure spending.
If it is clear, though, that tax cuts then are at best the most expensive and least effective way to create jobs, why are Democrats insisting on extending any of these tax cuts, even if it's to people in the middle class?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Keith. And I think to answer it, we have to look back at the inequalities in the tax code right now. In 2005, the New York Times did a study of what all the Bush tax cuts meant for the richest and middle class and lower class Americans, and found that because of the Bush tax cuts, the 400 richest households in America were paying the same share of their income on their federal income, Social Security, and Medicare taxes as Americans making $50,000 to $70,000.
Heather McGhee,
the 400 richest households were paying the same taxes, the same share in taxes as those in the middle class. And so the middle class and tax cuts for the low-income folks are really what we need to be investing in.
Heather, great thanks for your time tonight. Heather McGhee, the director of the DC